Hey guys, Richard Holder here. Let's talk 5-liter Ford cylinder heads. We're going to compare a set of stock cylinder heads to like 25 or 30 different aftermarket cylinder heads and some kind of stock cylinder heads. But don't worry, I'm not going to do that all in this video because that's too many. I broke it down into 4 videos because I broke it down into 4 test motors and basically 4 groups that all these cylinder heads fit into. Why am I inside and not out by the treehouse? It's raining in California. You know what happens if it gets below 71 degrees here in California. We just don't even go outside anymore. Let's check out our 5-liter head test. In this video, we're going to directly compare back-to-back cylinder heads. We're going to take the factory 5-liter Ford heads that they used from 1987 all the way up to where they stopped making the 5-liter Ford. We're going to compare those heads to a number of different aftermarket heads, including, and I need to look down here to make sure that I don't forget anybody because I don't want anybody getting mad, we're going to use the GT40P heads, the GT40 aluminum heads. We have heads from Holley, BRODIX, CANFIELD, Airflow Research, and World Products, the Windsor Junior heads, and I hope that I didn't forget anybody. We're going to compare all those directly back to back. We have a mild 306-inch carbureted motor with a small can, but we're going to go over all of that. So let's take a look at first all the specifications, what goes into all these heads. I measured all kinds of stuff, including airflow and valve train weight and port dimensions and all kinds of cool stuff. Then we'll get right into the power output, so let's check it out. This was one of those tests that I would, certainly while it was going on at the beginning, that I wanted to take back. It was a really good idea. Let's test, rather than do just one set of cylinder heads or compare that to stock or maybe 2 sets of cylinder heads, let's test all the cylinder heads. And while that's a really easy thing to say, it's a whole nother thing to actually do, because as it turned out, I had to build 4 test motors to make this happen. I had to measure do airflow testing on all of the heads. I had to do dyno testing on all the heads. We had to get the right push rod lengths for all the heads. We had to get the right rocker arms, the springs. I measured all of the port volumes, the spring weights, the combustion chambers. I mean, everything. So it was months and months worth of work. But we did get a lot of data, so it was all worthwhile. Then now we can look back and go, oh yeah, that wasn't that bad. But while it was going on, it was a lot of stuff. So we're going to start out with, before we get to the dyno results, let's start out with all of the data on all of the heads and recognize that there are 4 groups of heads here because all of the cylinder heads for a small block Ford don't fall into the same group. So I kind of group them into different sets that are kind of marketplace competitors and kind of port volume size and stuff, because obviously you're not going to compare a set of twisted wedge R heads to a set of replacement EDELBROCK performer heads. They're just not in the same league and they're not designed for the same application. So these are all heads that we started out that are fairly small and fairly mild and still good kind of performance heads. And the real takeaway from all of this is there are a lot of great heads, and almost all of them offer a fairly sizable upgrade to the factory head. But right now, we're going to take a look, and you guys can scroll through this stuff and pause the video and go back and take a look at all of this data, because there's a tremendous amount of data here. So we're going to start out. This data is all of the information on the cylinder heads, and we have the combustion chamber size. Excuse me, we have the intake port volume, the exhaust port volume, the intake valve size, the exhaust valve size, the installed height. We have seat pressure. We have open pressure at 550 lift. We have the coil bind, and I even measured the mass of the valve train. So we measured the intake valve, the spring, and the retainer, and the keeper. And then the same thing for the exhaust. So all that information is here. So I've separated these, and you can take a look. The first one, number 1, is a stock E7TE head. It's the stock iron head on an 87 and up, basically 5-liter combination. So it's basically the stock Ford head. It had a 61.5 cc combustion chamber, a 127 cc intake port, a 44 cc exhaust port. The valve combination was a 178 intake and a 146 exhaust. It had different installed heights for the valve springs on the intake and exhaust. It had different seat pressures actually for the intake and exhaust, and they both had about the same open pressure. They coil bind at about 600, and I think we had modified this one so that we could actually run the stock head with the camshaft that we had. So I don't think that a stock spring will actually take that much lift. And then I have the valve train weights here. So these are the interesting things to compare, because you can compare the valve train mass with the available RPM, because we ran into valve float in a lot of these. And then you can kind of, I'm going to scroll down through here, and as I said, you guys can stop this and pause it and take a look at all the different ones. But we ran a number of different heads, so we can take a look. We have the stock head. We have a Ford GT40P, which is a common one that you can go get from the wrecking yard from the Explorer stuff. You can also get the regular GT40 head. An EDELBROCK Performer, an Airflow Research 165. They also had a 185 back then. A World Products Windsor Junior. We had a Canfield. These were 170cc Canfield as cast heads. We had the Ford aluminum GT40 head and a BRODIX, set of BRODIX ST50 heads. And then a set of Holley. I think these are Systemax 17-degree heads. So these are all. This is all of the information. And again, you can go up to here and see what they are. But basically, I went through all of those. Now let's take a look at the airflow data. So I have it listed, broken down in 50,000 increments, all the way up to 550 lift on the stock one. And so you can correlate that, 50,000s was 29 cc or 29 CFM with the stock one, and then 54.5 and 82.5. And as we go up on increments, you can see that the factory head flowed a peak of 166 whopping CFM on the stock head. And then I have, this is all the intake flow data on all of these heads. So again, you can scroll through this, or I will scroll through this. You can stop it at any point, compare the stock one, and I have some comparisons down below also. So we have the stock head, the Ford GT40P head, the EDELBROCK Performer head, the Airflow Research 165, the World Products Windsor Junior, the Canfield head, the Ford GT40 aluminum head, the BRODIX ST50, and the Holley Systemax. And you can see, if you take a look at the peak flows on these, the Airflow Research head flowed 240 CFM, the EDELBROCK flowed 237, the Canfield was 244, and then the Ford aluminum, the GT40 heads and stuff were all quite a bit below that. The BRODIX was 239 and the Holley was 237. So they're all fairly comparable in peak flow, but you can take a look and kind of compare them yourselves through the mid-lift flow and kind of see what was going on. So we've got all of that data. Once again, I'll scroll through that so you guys can kind of take a look at that. And then you guys can stop those where you want. So and if we take a look at the exhaust flow, same thing. 50,000s through 550 lift. On our stock one, the exhaust flowed a whopping 112 CFM, which is not surprising why they don't support a ton of power, and why all of these heads, any of them, offered a fairly sizable increase in power compared to those stock E7TE heads. I mean, they were only designed to support 225 horsepower. And as we see, they'll support a bit more than that. I think we've made over 300 with them. And they work okay, but any of these heads are a much better upgrade for any of them. So here's the Ford GT40P and the EDELBROCK head. So we had the Airflow Research heads flowed 200 on the exhaust, which I think was the best of the group. So they had a lot of exhaust flow. The BRODIX was 180, the Canfield was 180, the EDELBROCK was close at 177, and then some of the other heads, the Holley was 172, but the aluminum GT40 heads were 145, 147. So you can see we got some big differences in exhaust flow, and then even though we had kind of comparable numbers, at least peak numbers for the intake flow. So here are the intake and exhaust flow numbers, and again, you guys can kind of scroll through this. And then what I've taken is and we've got some average airflow numbers for all of these, and I've combined the average airflow, the average intake airflow, and the average exhaust flow, and then combine those together. Not that that number is relative, but it's good information, I guess. And then I've numbered them to see where they fall in terms of which one had the best average number, which one had the best peak number, and which one had the average horsepower number, so you can kind of correlate those two after you see the power numbers. We'll be able to take a look at that stuff. So this is a lot of good information, but let's get to our power numbers on each of the cylinder heads. Now that we've taken a look at the airflow, we can check out the power gains offered by the different cylinder heads. And first of all, obviously we had to have a test motor, and this was a 306 inch, so a 30/302. It had a flat top piston with valve relief so that we had valve clearance for all the heads that we were running and for our camshaft. So the compression was somewhere in the low to mid 9s, depending on which combustion chamber you were applying that to. The motor had an RPM air gap intake manifold, a dual plane intake, and a 650 speed diamond carburetor. It also had a, obviously better than stock camshaft, it was an Extreme Energy 264 cam, which was a 512 lift, a 212, 218 degree duration split, and 114 degree lobe separation angle. So the first thing we did was run this with the stock heads, and as I said, we did put a valve spring upgrade on the stock heads so that it would work with this camshaft. But equipped with an 1 3/4 long tube headers, and after we obviously dialed in the timing and the airfield with the carb jetting, are basically 306 Ford with the stock heads produced 306 horsepower, so right at 1 horsepower per cubic inch, and 342 foot-pounds of torque. So we'll take a look at our first set of cylinder heads. And first up is the GT40P head. So the iron GT40P heads. And this was fairly common. The first thing you do is you look out at past the 5,900 or 6,000 RPM range. You see that the power fell off dramatically, and that's valve float. And that's because the supplied cylinder heads, we ran the heads the way that they were supplied by the manufacturer. They really all needed, almost all of them needed a valve spring upgrade. This was way back in the day when we ran this test, but they all needed a valve spring upgrade, especially with the Extreme Energy cam, which is a fairly aggressive cam profile. But, you know, valve springs would go a long way toward helping this thing out. Although we can kind of see, you know, what the power gain is offered by the P heads. But equipped with the P heads, this thing made 336 horsepower, and peak torque was up to 359 foot-pounds of torque. So there were good gains, and there were gains throughout, basically through the whole curve, and that's not surprising given the fact that the stock head is obviously not that great. Let's get to our next cylinder head. After running the GT40P head, we decided to run the GT40 aluminum head from Ford Racing, and this is our stock comparison here. Equipped with a GT40 aluminum head, it made more power than the P head, which is not surprising. It's a little better. Take a look at the airflow data, you can find that out. With the GT40A head, or the GT40 aluminum head, it made 353 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 363 foot-pounds of torque. And as we saw with the GT40P head as well, this thing increased power from 2,500, which is where we started this, all the way out. And because these are basically airflow gains, the gains increased with RPM. I think that the way that this thing fell off again, we're still looking at kind of a valve control problem with this. This will be a common theme as we go through all these cylinder heads. And remember, this test was run long ago, more than a decade ago. So a lot of things have changed with these heads from, you know, now. People offer different versions of these. And after seeing this test, a lot of these guys have upped the spring rates on their offerings. So probably all of this stuff has been taken care of. But this is what the GT40 aluminum heads. Let's take a look at our next set. Next up on our 306-inch test motor was a set of EDELBROCK heads. Again, this is our factory E7TE head. These are EDELBROCK Performer heads. And they actually did fairly well. We saw maybe a slight drop in power down here in the 25 to 27 or 2800 RPM range, but they picked power up a lot. And again, take a look at this, past 6100. Although I have to say the EDELBROCK heads went all the way out to 6100, but then this big drop off is just valve flow. But before it did, they produced 384 horsepower, which is a pretty stout gain from the factory 306 horsepower. So that's a big jump up in power. And again, as we expect, since it's an airflow deal, most of the gains came out, you know, at the top of the RPM range. But peak torque was up as well to 364 foot-pounds of torque. Yeah, try to select a spot here, 364 foot-pounds. So again, good power gains through the whole curve, except the very bottom. Big power, and I think a lot more potential with this EDELBROCK head, because if it had more valve spring in it, it would have kept revving and we may have made a little bit more power. It certainly would have carried out. If you were going to run this thing to 6,500, this would be a good combination, making good power. Let's check out our next head. Our next set of heads came from World Products. They were Windsor Junior heads. It's a popular head among the 306 or the 5-liter crowd, so that was pretty popular back in the day. So here's what our Windsor Junior heads did, and as expected, the gains increased with RPM, which we've seen some of the heads. They also lost a little bit of power up to 3,000 RPM. Peak torque on the Windsor Junior was up to 355 foot-pounds. Peak torque on the Windsor Junior was 351 horsepower, so the peak horsepower and peak torque were kind of similar. This one didn't seem to fall off too bad. A little bit of drop here between 5,900 and 6,000. So again, you know, I just want to see more spring rate. A lot of guys are worried about, I think that the head manufacturers were basically worried about having too much spring rate and flattening camshafts, but on a hydraulic roller cam, that's not really a concern. We've run solid roller spring rates with hydraulic roller cams and had real good luck with them for even basically overspringing them. So I don't think they have to worry too much about spring rate on these things. Most of the heads seem to come with spring rates that we'd use on a healthy flat tappet cam. But the hydraulic roller stuff obviously is quite a bit heavier. So make sure you have enough spring rate. But again, this Windsor Junior head, you know, 350 horsepower up from 306. So it did good. Let's get to our next set. Next up on our carbureted 5-liter test motor was a set from Canfield, and these were 170cc intake ports. They were as cast heads, and they did very well. Equipped with the Canfields, our test motor produced 369 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 369 foot-pounds. So again, even horsepower and even torque. And they did really well. They didn't lose any power down low. They picked up power through the whole curve after 2,800 RPM. Had good torque gains and, you know, good power gains out of the top as we would expect. A little bit of fall off here after 6,000. Again, more spring rate is necessary, but the Canfields did really well and they were popular back in the day. And I think Canfield may have done private label stuff for Ford Racing and for other guys too. So if you guys know in the comments, let me know. But I think that they did. Their heads looked very familiar compared to some of the other stuff that we saw. But the Canfields did well. Let's get to our next set. Obviously, for any cylinder head comparison, we had to include the guys from BRODIX because they had a ton of different offerings. These particular heads were their ST50 aluminum heads, and they worked very well. Here are the BRODIX heads. Pretty well even down below 28 or 2,900, maybe a slight touch, a loss 2 or 3 foot-pounds, but they came alive after that. Peak torque was up to 369 foot-pounds of torque, so good torque gains there. Peak power was up to 379 horsepower, and we saw a little bit of what I think is valve control up there up at the top. So, and definitely a drop off after 6,000. So again, spring rate probably would improve this position. There's no reason, given the head flow numbers, that these things can't easily make, you know, most of these heads, a lot of the good heads can't make way over 400 horsepower. They definitely have the airflow to support that. So we had a fairly mild cam in this thing and didn't have a lot of compression in it and stuff. But these heads are, you know, they show good gains over the stock stuff. But I don't want you to think that that's all that these heads will do, because they all have the airflow number to support a lot more power, including these BRODIX heads, which did very well. So let's check out our next set. In some cases, because this test was run so long ago, some of these heads might not even be available, and I don't think that the Holley heads that we ran in this test are available anymore. I don't think that they are. They did very well, and as with most of the other heads, but this is our stock head, our E7TE head. Here is our Holley head. It's a 20 degree, might have been the Systemax head, but equipped with the Holley, it made 377 horsepower, and peak torque was 369 foot-pounds. You can see the Holley head offered more power, even down low, even down at 2,500, a little bit more. Offered good torque through the middle. You know, offered good peak power out at 377, so it picked up over 70 horsepower, which is a nice gain, and didn't seem to fall off dramatically like some of the others. If we check the, maybe you guys can check the spring rates and see in the specs to see how this thing compares to some of the other ones. But this head did well, and again, once again showing there were lots of good heads. There were back then, and there certainly are now, probably even more now for the 5-liter Ford, and almost all of them are going to be a nice, healthy power gain over a stock head. Final set of heads run on this mild 306 came from the guys at Airflow Research, and because this was our mildest application, we chose the smallest set of heads. Back then they had a 165, a 185, and a 205 offering, so these were the 165 heads, which is a good choice for a 302, 306 kind of application. Here are the Airflow Research heads, and again, like the others, they kind of picked up power everywhere. They made good peak power. As a matter of fact, the highest of all the heads that we tested, 396 horsepower. if you check out the specs on the airflow heads, they had really good exhaust flow and they had good mid-lift flow as well. They also had, I think, the smallest combustion chamber. So for all of you cylinder head manufacturers out there, if you're going to send a set of cylinder heads to a competition, put your best foot forward. Make sure that they have lots of spring rate and that they have the whatever the smallest combustion chamber that you guys offer. Obviously, you don't want to doctor a set up, but whatever, a lot of times the head manufacturers will have different chamber sizes that they offer. So if you have that, make sure you send the smallest one with lots of spring rate so that your heads do very well. But the guys at Airflow Research, nobody said that they were dumb. Again, but like the others, this thing fell off fairly rapidly. As a matter of fact, this thing made peak power at only 57 or 5800 RPM, 5800 RPM. Peak torque on this was 378 foot-pounds, so it really did really well in the torque production as well. But like the others, these heads had enough to support way over 400 horsepower and were on their way to doing it before getting into what I can only assume is, valve control issue here. But again, all the heads did really well. Everything basically is a step up from the factory 5-liter head. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do you think about the results of our cylinder head test, our big 5-liter Ford cylinder head test, comparing the factory heads to all of these aftermarket heads? But first, I got to show you. Look at the reflection of my glasses. Look at the lights. I get a little vertigo, Look at the lights. Look at the lights. Look at the lights. Don't go into the light. Don't go into the light. We compared all the heads, the factory head, to all of these aftermarket cylinder heads. And we got a lot of cool results. But it's important to note, just like in these future tests that are coming up in part 2, 3, and 4, those cylinder heads will make a lot more power than we are making here. All of these heads flowed, the good ones flowed 235, 240, which is enough to support way over 400 horsepower, over 450 horsepower on the right kind of combination. So there's more cylinder head there than there is motor, which is a good combination because then anything that you do to the motor, like adding camshaft or compression or intake manifold, you always get more power when you're starting out with more cylinder head. This test also showed that there's lots of good heads. Almost any of these heads that you would put on and compare to the factory head, that's going to give you some good power gains. As we saw, some are better than others. That's okay. You guys need to also look at the price to determine, hey, are those power gains offset by the price? That's all important stuff. Now we're going to get to part 2 next. We've got a bigger motor. We've got more head flow. We've got more camshaft. We've got more compression. We've got more of anything. Thanks for joining, guys. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I'll try to stay warm here because it's under 71 degrees. Thanks, guys.